Husbands and wives that got divorced after 20 years of marriage, what made you decide to change your mind after all that time? He tried to kill me, which I feel is impolite. How rude. My husband's parents did this. He said he knew his parents weren't happy for a long time. Said they went to family therapy together, but ultimately once my husband went to the army, he was the younger of two, they divorced and both later married other people. These two could not get along for anything, they hated each other. At our wedding, we had to take separate family pictures with the dad and new wife and then with the mom and my sister-in-law. It was insane. Cut to about 2 years after our wedding and I get a phone call from father-in-law's wife of 10 years, she is in hysterics. She had caught him in bed with my mother-in-law. My husband would not believe it until he talked to his father. That was over 10 years ago. My in-laws both divorced their partners and have been together ever since. My mother-in-law has all their old family pictures on display everywhere and acts like they never divorced and have been together for over 4 decades, ha ha ha. This is a roller coaster, and that last part, dear God. Oh yeah, my Mill is something else. She came for a visit and I didn't find out until after she left that she had gone through my wedding album and cut the ex-wife out of all the pictures. Grinning squinting face. Luckily she is 1,400 miles away and my husband knows she's crazy. When I was 8, my dad threatened to leave my mom because he was threatened by her brother. My uncle didn't do anything wrong, but my dad didn't like another man in his kids' lives because he had fears of abandonment and getting replaced, still has those fears. So he gave my mom an ultimatum, it's your brother or me, you gotta choose. My mom, fearing to hold together a family, chose my dad. My uncle was broken about it because my mom was forced to shut him due to reasons he didn't even understand. Fast forward 6 years and my older brother, now in college, develops an outside view of the family life and began to understand the assholery of my dad. So my brother called my dad and gave him his full mind on what he thinks of my dad and how he's done petty things out of fear. My dad flipped and blamed my mom for that because he thought she was putting words in his mouth. Things were tense for a bit between my dad, father, and mother until my dad decided to move out officially because he felt not welcome in the family. That was 5 years ago and he's been living separately since then, but my parents are still legally married due to joint owning a lot of assets. A year ago, however, I found out that my dad had been dating a 25-year-old for over a year. He's 60. The scary thing was that my mom knew the whole time, but she didn't tell us because she feared how it would make us view our dad. My mom is still very broken up about the fact that it was my dad that left her, despite him having toxic and manipulative behavior toward her, me, and my brothers for the latter part of their 25-year marriage. Edit, my dad wasn't 8 ladders. Did your mom and her brother ever reconcile? Yay, my mom's been making an effort to rekindle with her brother and also trying to reintroduce him into our lives because essentially my bros and I weren't able to see him either. 23 years. I had lied to her several times over the years, and she always forgave me. The last time I lied to her about accruing a severe amount of debt due to a gambling addiction. I think she might have forgiven the lie, but she couldn't forgive the addiction and the chance I'd start gambling again. I started attending Gamblers Anonymous after I told her, but it was too little too late for her. On the plus side, I haven't gambled in almost 3 years. Edit, I wanted to thank everyone for the support. It was a struggle at first, but it gets easier as long as I take it one day at a time. I've made some amazing friends in my local recovery community, and I run a meeting once a week to help others that are suffering. My parents divorced after like 18 years due to gambling. He was a total dickhead when he was losing and I was a teenager. I was probably grounded for a year of my life or more. He hasn't gambled in 10 years now and is a freaking treat to be around. He still occasionally apologizes for being such an asshole. Had to watch my parents go through the paperwork to get divorced after my dad had a massive stroke and was forced to retire. It was the only way for them to keep the money from his pension and maintain his health insurance coverage. My parents got a divorce of convenience so Pops could make the mortgage payments and get his insulin. Thankfully my parents' insurance agent is a close friend, and found every possible form and loophole so they could stay in the house together. It took almost 2 years to get everything settled. I'll never forget my dad's statement after it was all done. The church still says we're married, and that's what matters to us. At least now, your mother can still get her hearing aids and pay the mortgage if something happens to me. I was so disgusted with it all. I never forgave my dad's union for it, and we now make sure someone from our family shows up to their annual open meeting when they discuss the health insurance plan to shame them in explicit detail with how the board fucks over the roughnecks. There's a guy in my town that everyone knows about because he owns this huge-ass mansion in a middle-class neighborhood. Apparently he was married to a woman for a long time but she left him, calling him a loser because his business hadn't taken off yet. After she left him, his business finally took off. He sells medical equipment to hospitals and he became fuck you levels of rich in a few years. The reason he built the mansion in that neighborhood was because that is where she lives, so she has to drive by the mansion on her way to work every day. My parents got divorced after 22 years of marriage. They were never in love and didn't even like each other. They had me and then my sister a few years later and wanted to stay together for the kids. 12 years after I was born they had my brother, and that kept the cycle going. I wish I could say they are happy now, but they still like to cause trouble for each other. We're due with our first child soon and they're gonna have to figure out how to be grandparents together. Thankfully I'm 1,500 miles from them, so it won't be a headache often. Was this some type of arranged marriage situation? What's funny is sometimes arranged marriage people end up liking it, because they feel they have no choice, so they try to make the best of the situation, and so sometimes, they do have this camaraderie from feeling like they're in the situation together, so they do grow close. It's bizarre, and I never would have believed it myself. It's effed up, but it sometimes happens that way. This is kinda what happened to my husband and me. We were sorta high school sweethearts and both aware that we are not really compatible and thought we not gonna make it to an full year. It was more of an physical relationship. After a bit more than 2 years I accidentally got pregnant and we both felt like we had to stay together. This was followed by another 2 hard years without any love, but after that we grew together and learned to love each other on a more mature base. I also have nothing but respect for the person he matured into. He took his new responsibilities very well. I worked at a law firm that only practiced family law, divorces, child custody, wills and estates, etc. At one time we had like 8 clients getting divorced after 20+ years of marriage, and they were all high-ranking military men whose wives came out of the closet after all their kids had grown up and moved out of the house and the guys were getting ready to retire. I thought it was so weird, but I guess for whatever reason the women thought that their duties to their husbands and families were coming to an end and they wanted to live for themselves. I guess I know why they couldn't come out 30 years ago. It was a different time, but I was curious why they were all attracted to military guys. I assume maybe cause it meant their husbands would be away for years at a time during their service? I think it depends more on how old the women were when they first married. Military people often tend to marry young and quickly. You don't know yourself when you're young. 20 years will do that to you. My mom was never allowed to know what a lesbian was until she was in her 20s. Other kids picked up on her lesbian vibe though. Kids would taunt and isolate her, mocking her. I was shocked when she told me this. The straight kids and their parents could pick up on mannerisms that made my mom seem lesbian as a kid, but no one ever let her know that women could have loving and committed relationships with each other. It was only ever fuel for cruelty. It wasn't until she was in her mid-20s that she understood that she loved women romantically. My parents split up after nearly 30 years. My dad was an asshole my entire life, so when they finally divorced when I was 18, there was no surprise. He'd been cheating for years and I think he was the one who finally asked for it. I think my mom stayed because she couldn't afford to start over. She spent her life putting my dad through school and wasn't educated herself. She had no family or anyone who could help her either. There was definitely some confidence issues on her part too. My parents divorced when I was 12. They thought I'd be devastated, but the only thing I could say was thank God. What took you so long? I don't think I could have endured 6 more years. Is your mom doing okay now? It's been about 6 years and I've never seen my mom as happy as she is now. Gaining so much independence was a huge confidence booster for her. Thanks for asking, smiley face. My husband began surreptitiously going to strip clubs. He stole about $200 a week from various accounts and a business I owned to fund these activities. He lost his job because he went there so often at lunch and would just stay. We had young kids and so I stayed after he got some therapy. He was never honest with the therapist. About a year ago I learned he was doing it again. Plus texting strippers. My youngest kid graduates high school this year. I've done what's best for everyone else for 20 years now. This September was 21 years. I don't anticipate having a 22nd anniversary. It's really scary to think of being alone. I don't hate him. I feel sorry for him. I know he will feel very sad and lonely when I'm gone. But being near him feels like having my soul ripped from my body every day. I hope you find some peace. You've been keeping it together for your family for so long. You need to live for you now. Therapy changed my mind. After more than a decade of being miserable, I finally got help. When I was able to really talk about my marriage was when I realized that I needed to get the fuck out. At the end of the day, I stayed in a shitty marriage because the thought of being alone scared me. Through therapy, I was clued into how many wonderfully supportive friends and family members I had if I just reached out to them. I wasn't going to be in a relationship anymore, but I wasn't alone either. It's weird, but I'm experiencing this ATM with my wife. She's gone through CBT and has now decided she's unhappy with our marriage setup. I admire her for doing it, but at the same time it's infuriating because half of long-drawn assertions are based on her own reflective comments to herself and not to others. I don't disrespect her for this, but it's hard discussing half-truths that are not validated. As an evil husband, on the other side of this, are there any olive branches you think I can use to help us heal things? I do love her with all my heart, but it's heartbreaking going through this. Edit. P.S. This is possibly the best question asked so far here. I went through something similar a few years ago. We nearly divorced, and it was presented to me as mostly my fault. She was unhappy in the relationship, which, to her, translated to being unhappy with me. But we're able to reconcile eventually. Here are some thoughts. Going to couples therapy together would be a good thing, with a different therapist than your wife uses. That can help identify issues with your marriage that both of you might be unaware of, and a good therapist will call both of you on your bullshit. If things are bad at home, a trial separation can help. It's hard to work on a broken relationship when both of you are still in the middle of it. Get some distance from each other, grow a little on your own, reconnect with yourself as an individual, and get a more objective view on what each of you are bringing to the relationship. In the end, you can't change her mind with grand gestures or pleading. You'll only drive her further away if you try. She's working through some things, and you can't help with that other than being supportive, which, unfortunately, often means staying out of the way while she does so. At this point, you need to focus on keeping yourself cared for, mentally, emotionally and physically. That means connecting with a support system of your own family, friends, getting back into some old hobbies or finding new ones, and finding a therapist of your own. Hitting the gym is optional, but taking care of yourself is not. It's easy to sink into depression when your life changes this radically. Keep up with hygiene and try keeping your living space clean and comfortable. And be kind to yourself. Being loved starts with loving who you are. I wish you both the best. Not myself, but my parents. They were married for 22 years when they separated, 24 years by the time the divorce was final. From the perspective of a child in the situation, there was no way that they were happy people together. There was hardly ever a quiet moment in the house because of my father's temper, but my mother knew how to serve it back too. However, the final straw was more of a chain of events. My father had a very rigid view of the family. Man works, woman stays home, cares for the home and children. When I was in high school, my father got injured at work and needed surgery. He worked a physically demanding job, and would be out for 6 months. My mother, knowing that we were already falling behind on vehicle and house payments, decided to find part-time employment. She worked while the kids were in school. It was still important to her to see her kids get on the bus and be there when they got home. My father immediately believed that she was cheating on him. He installed a tracker and tape recorder in her car. He showed up at her workplace and caused a scene multiple times. He questioned her coworkers. He spent most of time at the house drinking. This was not an equal partnership, and it really never was. You should have seen how hurt he acted when my mom finally asked for a divorce. But he rebounded real quick. All he had to do was tell some woman on Plenty of Fish his sob story, and he moved right into her house. He spent a couple of years treating her and her children horribly before she kicked him out. Only took him a couple of weeks in a hotel to find another woman to let him move in. Sounds like my grandpa, except when he started drinking and accusing grandma of cheating, he beat the shit out of her. It all backfired one day though. Grandpa had 7 sons, all really good wrestlers and boxers, because grandpa thought men should know how to fight. One day they ganged up on Grandpa, they were 8 to 17, beat the shit out of him, tied him up to a tree and left him outside all night. Then they told him they'd kill him if he ever drank or hit Grandma again. It's crazy to me because I only ever got to meet the nice version of my grandpa who didn't drink. We were together for 20 years, married for 15. We started as high school sweethearts, but we eventually realized that we weren't the same people we were when we fell in love. We also realized that that wasn't going to change. We decided that the best way for everyone to be happy for the rest of our lives was to end it on peaceful terms before we were both 70 and resentful of each other for trapping each other in an unhappy marriage for 40+ years. Similar story here. Started dating at 17, got married way too young. By our 30s we were completely different people. At 40 I asked myself, can I do this for the rest of my life, and realized the answer was no. We both have new lives now and eventually each found new partners and are much happier. I think the second time around, especially when you're older, you know exactly what you want and what you are or aren't willing to put up with. Well, funny story. My parents were high school sweethearts, and married for 22 years. Then they got divorced when I was 6. My dad remarried and had another kid, and got divorced again. My mom never did. Fast forward about 30 years. I got married. My parents were in the same room for the first time in 30 years and were flirting like teenagers. I have video of it. It really is pretty amusing to watch. Until I remember it's my parents. They have been dating since I got married. That was more than 5 years ago. They are virtually living together, and both of them think it's funny to allude to their sex life around me so that I'll be embarrassed. Which still works, despite my age. As to your question, my mom says that my dad has mellowed and turned into not a bad guy. My dad says my mom is exactly the same, except her waist. I think they both never found anyone they liked as much as each other. Or hated as much as each other. And if that isn't marriage, I don't know what the hell is. Obligatory. Not me, my parents. My dad filed for divorce after 25 years of marriage. My mom was shell-shocked. My dad was absolutely miserable, but the signs of a failed marriage were always present. My dad is very emotional and is quick to anger. He never really handled failure very effectively and would be mad instead of constructive. My mom very family-oriented and was adamant that we never move farther than 40 miles from Chicago. Hell, when I was going away to college, she bawled to my dad to force me to go to a school closer to home. In a way, I think my dad resented my mom for never letting him travel or get away from Chicago. It also doesn't help that I'm fairly certain my mom became undiagnosed depressed once her mom died. All she would do was do her bare minimum at her job, a school bus driver, come home and sleep, finish her route for the day, cook a hamburger helper meal for the family, and then play Angry Birds on her iPad. It's really weird seeing your parents divorce in your 20s. You're adult enough to speak candidly and neither of them likes what you have to say about them during or after the fact. The silver lining out of it is my sisters and I know how not to behave in a relationship. Not me, but my grandmother once told me that she was considering divorcing her husband of over 50 years. The reason she gave me was, we stayed together for the kids. Now the kids are all grown up and have lives of their own. And now I can't ignore the small things about him, my grandpa, that annoy me. She didn't go through with it, but she seemed sincere when she said it. It broke my heart, especially since I only ever saw the best side of him. Edit. Thank you for the silver, kind stranger. Heard a story about a couple divorcing in their late 80s after approximately 70 years of marriage. When asked why they waited with it for so long, they responded that they did not want to disappoint their children. So they did it when their children died of old age. I will be one of the few that speaks from experience. I have been married 20 years, and we are on the edge. The answer is that life changes you. When you start out the relationship as its own thing, it is cultivated and grows. Then over the years add some children and full-time jobs, and there is less time to cultivate, or none. You end up becoming life partners to run the household, and wonder why you are even together. Since there are no good times, all that is left are arguments and bad times. This is all normal, and on top of that you are both going through the personal struggles of living. To be honest, staying married is tougher than most people think in an age without divorce social stigma. The kids do keep you together, hoping somehow you can rekindle something that once existed. And this is in a situation with two good people trying to do the right thing, and not a toxic situation with abuse. Didn't get divorced but started the process after about 25 years. Stuck it out for a few more years for the kids and ended up falling in love with her after the kids moved out. Relationships follow cycles, so glad I stuck it out. So few people understand this. People think that if you're not fever mad in love with your partner every second of every day, your relationship is over. Especially once you have kids, things ebb and flow. Sometimes my wife and I are barely more than roommates. Then we finally get a date night to ourselves, and the spark is there again just as strong as ever. Life can be really difficult, and gets in the way of good things. Best piece of advice my grandmother gave me when I got married was this: when you get married you cannot forget who you are as an individual, who you are as a married couple, and who you are as a parent. In that order. She wasn't trying to say the kids aren't important or are somehow less important, but that if you don't take care of yourself, you can't be a loving spouse, and if you can't do those two things, it's a lot harder to be a great parent. She and Grandpa just had their 53rd anniversary. Edit, thank you for the gold. Also a fun thing Grandma once said when asked if she ever considered divorce: never, murder, yes, but never divorce. A friend of mine was married for nearly 30 years, 2 kids. As she put it, they'd been playing divorce chicken for a decade. There weren't any concrete reasons to get divorced, they didn't fight, they actually got along very well. They just weren't in love anymore. There was always a good pragmatic reason for them to stick together. They co-parented effectively, they actually liked each other, they kept saying their marriage was probably better than a lot of people's. A few years ago they just decided it was time. They went out for drinks and started hashing out how to divide their assets. They agreed on a 50-50 split. They got a lawyer to make everything legit, and a few months later they got divorced. My friend's ex-husband rented a house a few blocks away so they kids could easily walk between mom's and dad's house. About 6 months after the divorce was finalized, my friend's ex-husband set her up with a new boyfriend. They go on double dates, they go to parent-teacher conferences together. What a refreshingly sensible way to approach such a sensitive issue. Rather than drag it along like so many others, they were able to see that they weren't happy, and even more surprisingly they didn't hold bitterness and grudges towards each other. I wish all the people who aren't happy in their current life situation could behave so maturely and handle it in such a healthy way. My dad had multiple affairs and my mom got tired of it. There was also alcoholism and both parents were workaholics. My dad remarried a lovely woman, and so did my mom. Oh, that may have been an issue too. Edit, gold? Thank you, kind stranger. Must be rough when they discovered they married the same woman.